Okay, aloha. Thank you all for coming to this special Governing Green Power presentation by Frank Wolak. I'm just going to take a couple minutes to tell you about what it is a small group of us are trying to do here at UH and kind of involve ourselves a little bit in the policy process, and then I'll introduce Frank. This talk is basically being hosted by a little group of us that we call Governing Green Power. And Governing Green Power are these folks right here. A bunch of them are in the room right now. But not all of them could make it. Carl Friedman's out of town right now. But basically we're just a ragtag group of people here from the university and major energy players in the community. And we kind of got together to kind of talk policy issues, and we're trying to just raise the level of conversation here. Because we think that what's happening with energy here in Hawaii, but probably eventually throughout the world, is pretty dramatic and quite different from the past. And at least historically, we know that institutions tend to change pretty slow relative to in response to changing technology. So we're seeing a lot of change in technology around renewable energy and associated things like batteries and connected devices and distributed services. And trying to figure out the institutions that can manage these things efficiently is going to take some time. It's going to be difficult. But we believe that that's probably most critical to really getting rid of fossil fuels or reducing them dramatically. That's probably the biggest crux, more than technological advance. And so we want to try to get the best thinking about rules and regulations and institutions and get that implemented as quickly as possible. So that's kind of our mission. And we're doing that through a few channels. Our activities right now are pretty limited, but we want to basically try to identify the most critical questions and issues right now and let those evolve over time, so we have kind of a working list of what we see as most critical. We're going to invite some experts, visitors like Frank Wolak we have today, to speak on key issues, and we're going to we've scheduled a bunch of meetings with the consumer advocate, the PUC, with HECO, and with environmental interests on Monday to interact with Frank and get his ideas. And then we're trying to have a conference every spring, and the character of that conference varies a little bit from year to year, but where we try to get people to engage on these issues. We all have different ideas. The people who are part of this, we don't have a particular agenda. We're all focused on the public interest, and we all have, of course, our own opinions and views. Okay, so I thought I'd just review really quickly before I introduce Frank what our major questions are right now, because these major questions that we have right now are really motivating who we invite and what we ask them to talk about. So these are I rephrased these a little bit from some back and forth we've had with our group, but how can we develop an institutional framework that facilitates distribution level open access to the grid for buying and selling of electricity and reserves? On the mainland, there's a lot of energy markets and throughout the world, and there's to some extent you have this, but it's kind of hard to get buying and selling at the distribution level, which is what the new technologies really seem to be about. But here, we don't have markets. It's all kind of distribution level stuff, and we don't have, for renewable energy, we can't just transmit our renewable energy to another location. So we're really a good laboratory for thinking about distribution level buying and selling. 2, how should the issue of rising fixed costs be addressed? Fixed costs are becoming a much larger share of our overall costs, and how do we deal with that? Number 3, why are utility-scale renewables so much more costly in Hawaii than in other parts of the United States and the world? You hear a lot of stories for why this might be the case, but we think this needs to be clarified. 4, how can we facilitate more efficient investment and planning for a high renewable future? Planning for high renewable systems is a lot more difficult than a traditional system. We need different software. Matthias Fripp, my colleague here in the front row, is, I think, the leader in thinking about how to do that, but that needs more refinement too. In 5, how can we prepare for the possibility of mass grid or load defection? That's part of the reason for our rising fixed costs, and I worry about that a lot. And I think a lot of people tell you, oh, that's not going to happen. No one's going to really want to get off the grid. But what if they're wrong? I think we have to wrestle with that possibility that even if we do the best job we can, we might be facing that. What's our exit strategy? So those are our major motivating questions. People might have different ideas about them, but I think we need to focus on them. I think Frank Wolak is a great person to start to wrestle with these. So let me just tell you a little bit about Frank. Frank is the Holbrook Working Professor of Commodity Price Studies in the Department of Economics at Stanford University. He's also director of the Program of Energy and Sustainable Development at Stanford, a program that focuses on the design, performance, and monitoring of energy and environmental markets in the United States and globally. From 1998 to 2001, he was chair of the Market Surveillance Committee of the California Independent System Operator. That's which basically runs California's energy markets, or electricity markets. Wolak worked on the design and regulatory oversight of the electricity markets in Europe, Australia, Asia, Latin America, and the United States, and the design of transmission and distribution network planning, expansion, and pricing protocols to support the expansion of renewable energy resources in the United States, Australia, Canada, Chile, Peru, and the United Kingdom. From 2012 to 2014, he was a member of the Emissions Market Advisory Committee for California's Market for Greenhouse Gas Emissions Allowances, which advised the California Air Resources Board on the design and monitoring of the state's cap-and-trade market for greenhouse gas emissions and allowances. He's a professor of industrial organization. He really focuses on issues of market power and market concentration, and has looked at lots of industries besides energy as well. But he's one of the nation's leading experts in energy, and it's a real pleasure to have you here, Frank. So with that, I'll flip the screen to his and let you take it over.
Thanks.
Let's see if I think you want me to.
Did you take it home? Here, I think that's it. Here we go.
Okay, great. Oh, one last thing. We're going to open it up for questions at the end, so hang out till at least 6 o'clock.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Michael. Okay, so I'm glad at least it sounds like Michael and I are on the same page in terms of what the policy goal is. To me, I think the two challenges are, to effectively build and operate the network transmission and distribution within within the islands to facilitate this what I'll call least cost deployment of grid supplied and distributed renewable energy, and the other is pricing, so that effectively what we get is the efficient utilization of these two resources. And I think the last thing is that I think we also need to acknowledge, this is just my opinion, but I think the political process is certainly going to make that the case, is that it's not just about economics as to the reason why someone may want to put solar panels on their roof. And so probably we should at least have as part of our policy goal, giving consumers the option to install it. We don't want to make it so that it essentially is inefficient for this to occur, or so massively inefficient in terms of economically for this to occur, and then pushing costs on others. But I think we want to give all customers that option. But that just seems, based on maybe that's as a result of living in California and seeing what's happened. So what I thought I'd talk about first is just to sort of set up the problem and to say, okay, what's the traditional approach to utility regulation and performance-based regulation, because this is a topic that seems to be coming up in increasing importance here. And the basic question I'd say is, isn't all regulation performance-based is the question that I'll try to answer. Then the next is talk about, well, what's been going on other places besides Hawaii in terms of this introducing markets, as Michael's talked about. And the question to try to look at is a competitive market possible in Hawaii? And then to say, okay, we've now got this new entrant, which is essentially grid-supplied electricity, which is distributed solar. And the big point that I want to try to get across here is what I'll call this concept of inefficient bypass, and talk about that in terms of what's happening and how we might correct that. And then then to say, okay, given what we've identified as the issues on the regulatory side, on the pricing side, how do we adopt to the new competitive landscape? Do we want more competition? Do we want more regulation? My answer there would be yes and yes, but it's going to be obviously probably contradictory, but it's in different places. And so that's the basic point that I want to get across there. And then just to go in terms of what are future directions. In other words, Michael hinted at some of the things that I think are particularly important future directions for really pushing up, if you like, the amount of renewables that you're going to actually get into your system. There's going to need to be some changes. Okay, so probably this is a little baby for everyone, but just to fix ideas for everyone, in the vertically integrated regime, what we basically had and we have is essentially one company is essentially the geographic monopoly for producing it, transmitting it, distributing it, and selling it at retail to final consumers. And so what we have in that case is, because we've got this problem of the monopoly status, inelastic demand for the product, essentially they can charge a very, very high price, far in excess of average cost, and still get the customers to buy. So what we've evolved to in virtually all the states is state-level regulation by the State Public Utilities Commission. Okay, so and the typical way that this regulation takes place is by what is often referred to as cost of service regulation. But I'd argue that's a misnomer, because if it was cost of service regulation, then the regulator would allow the utility to recover all costs of serving demand, because that's what it costed. But that's not what it is. I think a more accurate way to call it is to say it's output price regulation. And there is this implicit, as I say, regulatory bargain. The regulatory bargain is that the regulated firm says, all right, I agree to serve all demand at the price you, the regulator, set. And the regulator says, I agree to set a price that allows you to recover all prudently incurred costs. And and that's basically the bargain. You got to serve all demand at the price I set. I agree to set a price that allows you the opportunity to recover your prudently incurred costs. Not all your costs, only prudently incurred costs. And there are different degrees. So, for example, in some markets, the big argument, as I said, is that what are prudently incurred costs? And that's what we have lawyers for, and that's what we have regulatory processes for, is to essentially figure out what those prudently incurred costs are. So how does the cost of service regulatory process work? The reason I want to get into this a little bit is just to say, what kind of incentives does it create, and to try to answer that question of what is performance-based regulation, and isn't all regulation performance-based regulation? And so in the cost of service regulatory process, and this is dramatically simplifying, but I think capturing the essential features, we have the price of output, the quantity of output, and think of C of Q are essentially prudently incurred variable cost to produce output quantity Q. We could think of V as the accumulated value of tangible and intangible property, so think of it as power plants, transmission lines, etc. And then this is the accumulated depreciation, and the difference between those two is what's called the rate base, okay? And then we think of S as essentially this allowed rate of return on this rate base. And then we come up, typically in virtually all regulatory processes in the United States, is we have this thing called a test year output. So the regulator and the firm typically argue about what the test year output is going to be, and then once they make that decision, then they come up with this equation right here that essentially says, take the test year output, compute what you think is the prudently incurred variable cost of producing, take the rate of return times the rate base, divide by that test year output, there you have your price. And the important thing here is the fact that the magnitude in the denominator there is what's often referred to in the regulatory process as the firm's revenue requirement. And this rate base is certainly something that's quite useful to the firm, because what it really amounts to is it says, once I, as the utility, get something in my rate base, essentially I get to earn S on that investment over the life of that investment, and typically the life of that investment is set by the regulator according to depreciation schedules. And so another way that the utility argues against the regulator is how fast assets get depreciated. But basically, as I said, the regulator decides when an investment can be put into the rate base and also sets the return that it can earn on that. Now, the other thing is that because of the fact that we've got this large fixed cost through the rate base, we typically have that the price that's set is significantly in excess of the marginal cost of producing, so short run marginal cost of producing this output, and it's closer to the average cost of the utility. But the other thing that's true is that once in this cost of service, or I'd say output price regulatory process, once that firm's price is set, maximizing profits is essentially minimizing costs, right? Because why? Because let's go back to the regulatory bargain. Regulatory bargain says, I will supply everything to the market at the price that you, the regulator, set. With that promise, that in the language of economics is saying price determines demand, demand times price gives revenues. They're exogenous to what the firm can do. So what the firm wants to do to maximize profits is it wants to get its costs down. So if we, as I said, if we solve this regulatory challenge, the answer is not necessarily, but in some sense the way that we have solved it is through this thing that's often called regulatory lag. So the longer that we can set this regulatory price remains fixed or invariant to any action that the firm might take, and therefore its revenues are exogenous to any action the firm might take, the longer over the horizon the firm wants to minimize cost. But there's a problem, and the problem is the longer the regulatory price stays fixed, the greater is the likelihood it will fail to recover the firm's cost of serving demand. And that's a problem, since that's not an outcome that as we'll discuss in a few minutes, that the law allows. So what does performance-based regulation do? Well, it, I'd argue, effectively just attempts to do this a little bit better. And what I mean by that is it wants to provide a stronger incentive. So one of the forms, a very popular form of performance-based regulation, that is what's called price cap regulation. And so what you're doing here is you're saying, what I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially, if you like, do a more sophisticated form of a regulatory lag, in the sense that I'm going to specify a time path for the prices of the firm's output that effectively I think I can commit to for a much longer time. Because remember, the longer the time period I can commit to an exogenous price invariant to the behavior of the firm, the greater the firm's incentive is to want to minimize its production costs and therefore, reduce the cost of serving demand. Granted, it may not all get passed through in the price that the firm's able to charge, but at least we're getting efficient production, and hopefully we can get better at essentially setting the level of the price. And so, as I said, it's really this idea that the output price does not depend, as we said, on the firm's actions. Its revenues are dependent on its actions. And so if we could figure out a rule for setting that firm's regulated price into the indefinite future then we would have the firm wanting very much to keep its costs down, okay? But there's a problem. The problem is that I argue what price cap regulation and most so-called performance-based regulatory processes do is they essentially make what I would call is an unenforceable contract with the firm. And what I mean is that essentially most of the time these things evolve into a form of cost of service regulation, and in fact a pretty inefficient form of cost of service regulation. Examples of this, I think, certainly were in the early days of the UK restructuring process with respect to its regional electricity companies, which were all the electricity retailers, National Grid Company, which was the grid operator for the market. National Grid made so much money in its performance-based regulatory process, they bought virtually everything in the United States that moved in the electricity sector. And then a number of US telecoms firms. So what's the major problem with these forms of regulation? It's just this simple idea, which is stealing is illegal. And in particular, there aren't laws laws against confiscating a regulated firm's assets. And it's impossible to tell the difference between an output price that's going to confiscate their assets versus an output price that says least cost production. And firms know this. They understand the value of this information asymmetry that exists. And so effectively what happens is that when in most of these price cap and performance-based plans, when the performance-based plan is very profitable for the firm, they'll take the profits. When the performance-based plan is very unprofitable for the firm, they come in and they file a lawsuit that says, Your Honor, how do you think an equation like this can describe how our costs evolve? This is preposterous to believe that that could be true, and typically they hire lots of smart economists and lawyers and the like, and they win. So what happens is you have this problem that virtually all these performance-based regulations have essentially become de facto, if you like, cost of service regulation with essentially an option to obtain high profits. And the important thing always to remember in regulatory price setting processes is any money that goes to the firm comes from the consumer. So if the firm's making more profits, consumers are paying more. And so, as I said, the basic idea is, it's not to say that performance-based regulation could not work. It's just to say that be careful that this is what often happens, is that you give them the upside, okay, in terms of much, much higher profits, and you pre-commit not to intervene if they get a big upside, but they always have the option to essentially come back and say, what you've said to me is confiscating my assets, and exercise that option to essentially truncate the downside, and that is the challenge. Okay, so what are the key points on this? As we said, regulated prices typically set significantly above short-run marginal cost in order to recover the fixed costs that we've shown. And we discussed that, look, cost of service regulation, because of regulatory lag and how it works, is really a form of performance-based regulation. And to just beware that many things that are performance-based regulation give the carrot and give a nice hefty carrot, but the stick is really hard to enforce. It's pretty much an unenforceable stick because of the fact that we have laws against theft. Okay, so introducing competition. What's changed in the wholesale, in the electricity industry? And so starting in the 1990s in most of the US, following on from what was happening in places like Chile, in UK, the United States started to do what was called restructuring. And restructuring is not deregulation, because believe it or not, even though we have market-based pricing in many parts of the United States, we have not deregulated electricity in the sense of the price of electricity wholesale electricity still must be just and reasonable. The Federal Power Act in the United States is still in force. Now, true, for Hawaii that's not relevant because you guys aren't interconnected, so you don't engage in interstate competition, but in every part of the continental United States, except for Texas, this is true. So And I think also, the reason I think it's important to think restructuring is because you can't get rid of regulation in this industry, at least not yet. And you know, what we did in the old regime is we're going to replace the retail price regulation with just simply regulating the things that we think you can't have competition in, and that is the interstate transmission network or the high voltage transmission network and the local distribution network. We're gonna operate those as open access, and then we're going to try to have market mechanisms for the wholesale market and market mechanisms for retail markets. Now, the regions differ in terms of the extent to which they've gone to retail competition, but virtually, you know, so for example, in what's called PJM, which is pretty much all the eastern seaboard states, New England, New York, there's Midwest ISO, there's the Texas ISO called ERCOT, which is the Texas market, and then there's California. These are all essentially formal, what's called bid-based markets. And so what happens is suppliers, essentially all the generators over here, they basically bid to supply energy to final consumers, and in places like Texas, there are retailers that compete to purchase energy from the wholesale market to essentially sell to final consumers. And just like in the case of competition between telecommunications providers, the wires are the same, it's only the name of the person you send your bill to that changes, and you know, and that's essentially the idea. And there is, at least in ERCOT, vigorous retail competition and some really creative pricing plans. One of my favorite pricing plans is the 1 cent power plan, is that you can essentially buy your power for 1 cent. But you better be pretty good at buying your power as a retail consumer, and for reasons that if not, I'd be happy to talk about later, but it'll take a little while. Okay, so essentially, as we said, we're going to always need regulation. Why? Because Tesla wasn't right. Even though he thought he could deliver electricity wirelessly, he never really demonstrated that at any sort of scale. And so we still need that transmission and distribution grid. And we believe that at least if there were competition among multiple grids, one would eventually win. This would be wasteful. And so therefore we're just gonna designate it as a monopoly supplier of transmission services, and we're going to regulate it. And if we didn't regulate it, then essentially the transmission and distribution network provider could capture all the monopoly rents, okay? And you know, essentially foil our whole attempt at competition. So, you know, the basic idea is that we're obviously, I always think about it when we're thinking in terms of designing these markets, this is the world that we're always living in. We're always living in the world of imperfectly competitive market versus imperfectly regulatory process, and we're picking sort of the choice between the two for the various segments of the industry. So in the case of restructuring, we're saying, okay, we'll go with an imperfectly regulated transmission and distribution sector, but we think a imperfectly competitive generation and retailing sector is probably a better way to achieve our overall goal. Whereas in the vertically integrated regime, we said, okay, we think that it's possible, but we're going to just go with imperfect regulation of the entire industry. We think that's the way to go. So, can wholesale competition work in Hawaii? This was, I just picked up for the island of Oahu, to just what are the generation resources owned by Hawaii Electric, as well as the other guys. You know, there's certainly not a lot of resources, but I'd say, and this is just to show you that what demand looks like. The big point that I want to take away is you can see demand, at least what it shows, is roughly is roughly about 1,200 megawatt hours. That's the annual peak demand, and it is, you know, I think difficult to see how you could have a bid-based wholesale market similar to what you have in the United States, largely because I think you would have a significant amount of competition issues here. You know, you just don't have a lot of firms. You've got one large firm, true, you've got some IPPs, and you know, it's just, there's a lot of challenges. So think of it as the size of demand relative to what you think is sort of the minimum efficient scale, at least for a thermal unit. Like even the smallest combined cycle unit is at least bigger than 200 megawatts. You know, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But the point that I wanted to make here is to say, I think there are alternative solutions based on international experience that could be implemented here, that could have substantial benefits in terms of both improving the efficiency of the wholesale side of the market and providing a much more competitive market in terms of the supply of PPA, power purchase agreements, and the like. So, key points from thinking about this is that we can't eliminate the need. We still need to have at least minimal amount of regulation as transmission and distribution. And we said wholesale markets, one of the big challenges was, of course, the fact that the short-term wholesale markets, market power problems, it's the way I like to say it is, and why I think electricity markets are so interesting is because they are the fruit fly of markets. If there's going to be a market design flaw, it shows up quickly and it costs a lot of money. And this is certainly sort of the poster child, the sort of conditions that you have here for those problems showing up if you attempted to set up a short-term bid-based market. So, and then, you know, the conclusion being that at least as practiced in the continental U.S., this sort of market seems probably a bridge too far. Okay, so what's happening and what's disrupting this industry, particularly in Hawaii, it's the grid, the viable competitor to grid supplied electricity. It's distributed solar, and you know what it does is essentially gives me the ability to avoid purchases from the grid. I only pay for what I withdraw, and the good news is the retail price is the avoided cost of energy for me consuming from my solar panels, as long as the amount that I consume in a month is less than the amount that I produce from my solar panels in the month. I'm effectively, that's the avoided cost that I'm having. I'm not having to buy any retail power. To the extent that I produce more in the billing interval or metering interval, we get into the realm of what do you do and how do you compensate me for what I produce beyond that. But for the most part, you know, we can talk about that a bit later, but the basic idea is it is this avoided cost of purchasing retail power. And the other thing to notice is that we load all of these costs into the retail price, and that this is typically much greater than the marginal cost of grid supplied electricity, which would be just what's the marginal cost of energy that hour plus the marginal cost of delivering that energy to you. Okay, and the marginal cost of delivering that energy to you is what's the sort of, maybe perhaps the marginal losses from when it exits the transmission grid to when it hits your house. You know, those kinds of marginal losses just aren't that large, and so this marginal cost is typically much smaller than this retail price. And so what does that do? Well, we can take the example of California to show what it does, since I don't only want to pick on Hawaii, California has roughly more than 7,000 megawatts of distributed solar installed. Most of it came under the California Solar Initiative, where we paid people roughly $2 billion, a little more than $2 billion to fund it from all the people that didn't install distributed solar. Which is this as a personal story I can tell you is that it was one of these things that, as you'll say, the inefficiency of this program, massive, but we'll put that aside. But eventually, morality has a cost. Even I decided to install solar because it got so expensive. So, to consume from the grid, the opportunity cost became unbearable, as you'll see. So California also has a 33% renewables, 60% by 2030. We purchased a whole bunch of above market renewables in order to get to our renewables goals. Those all go into that retail price divided by the quantity to give market up even higher. The energy efficiency programs in California, $1 billion a year, further puts into that retail price. All these raise the average retail price and so what we get is, as we say, as more people install solar, we would expect that retail prices increase. The first would just be what I'll call this mechanical effect, which means as more and more people are installing solar, the denominator in that price setting equation is getting smaller, the fixed costs are staying the same, so the retail price has got to rise. So that's the so-called the mechanical effect. The other effect that certainly is relevant in California as well is that the fact that what we have to do is manage the distribution grid and potentially make significant investments, particularly where rich people live that want to put solar panels on their roof, so it's even better. And so that we can manage the large surges in the production of solar and push that around in the distribution grid, we need to make these upgrades to be able to accommodate that. And there has been a significant amount of upgrades in California as a result that have also led to higher retail prices. So this is just to show you some patterns of production, just to how even for a fixed mount system on your roof, what you see, and this is for across days of the month, you can see how volatile it is, just to give you. But to get back to the story of inefficient pricing, what we see is roughly the average price in California is 23 cents. The highest marginal price in the PG&E territory is 40 cents. There are other territories in California where the marginal price is as high as 50 cents. And so, even if you're buying solar unsubsidized, it is such a good deal. I mean, you're getting a levelized cost for $3 a watt solar to roughly about 15 cents, 3% real discount rate. And going solar with no subsidies is extremely privately profitable, right? I basically avoid the 40-cent marginal price or even the average 23 cents per kilowatt price, and I only have to pay 15 cents for my electricity from solar. But here's the problem. The average wholesale cost of energy, including ancillary services, uplift, in California, the average hourly value of that was roughly 4 cents per kilowatt hour in 2017. So this is essentially an example of what we would call inefficient bypass, in that it's socially unprofitable for me to invest in rooftop solar, right? Because of the fact that I could get the same energy from my system at 4 cents a kilowatt hour, but it's privately profitable for me to do so because of the fact that the retail price is has loaded in all these fixed costs. So we said this divergence between the privately optimal decision and the socially optimal decision is due to this inefficient retail pricing. In other words, the more than 18-cent difference between the average retail price and the average hourly marginal cost is that's definitely going to cause a lot of people like me to essentially say, okay, fine, enough. Just to give you an example, my monthly electricity bill went from roughly about $200 a month before I installed distributed solar to they pay me. True, I feel a little guilty pushing all those costs onto all the people who don't own a home, that can't put solar panels on the roof, but I avoid $200 a month. So as I said, it's cheaper on a system-wide basis for me to have purchased the power at essentially roughly 4.5 cents, but the California PUC wouldn't let me do that. They make me, pay according to this price. So what's my only choice? Install distributed solar. And so the other thing to notice is, well, why wasn't this a problem before? Well, it wasn't a problem before because my choice was different. My choice was no electricity or, electricity from the grid. So in other words, the inefficiency wouldn't cause me to bypass the grid because the alternative of bypassing the grid was probably, owning a lot of batteries at my house and, charging them at my friend's house and then maybe using those batteries or something. It was, grid supplied electricity or nothing, and grid supplied electricity always beat nothing. Whereas now, I have a pretty viable alternative, although an alternative that is essentially that many people pick because of the inefficient pricing. So this just gives an example of, that Hawaii is in a similar situation. This is essentially the average electricity price. This is what they estimate to be the energy charge. This difference, is roughly about a 10-cent gap between the two. And this graph is just showing that, in terms of that gap, and the cost of that difference is growing and quite substantial. So, just like in California, we need to address this and address it very quickly. And why do we need to address it quickly? Well, this is based on some stuff that I did in California, where I tried to look at this question of what is driving this dollar per kilowatt hour retail price increase as a result of solar PV installations. And what I wanted to try to do was to sort of decompose it in what you could call the mechanical effect of more solar installations mean less withdrawals from the grid, and then more solar installations driving increased grid integration costs in terms of trying to measure that. And this is part of what's often referred to as utility death spiral, but which I'm not going to endorse, but just note. What I found was roughly about a third of the increases in the dollar per kilowatt hour increase in the retail price could be attributed to this mechanical effect. I mean, you're shoving 7,000 megawatts of capacity into a system that has a peak demand of roughly about 45,000 megawatts, so that's not small, even though it produces at a fairly low capacity factor. But most of it is due to this upgrading the distribution grid to accommodate this. So it's expensive to invest in the distribution grid to accommodate the high amounts of solar that we're seeing in California. Why? Well, probably for the same reason that it's expensive here, is that it typically tends to be concentrated in areas where people, a lot of people tend to do it. And so that makes your problem even worse in terms of the things that you need to do to manage that. Okay, so what are sort of the key takeaways from this? Well, first is this inefficient bypass that we talked about, that raises system-wide cost of supplying everyone. And then the other is that this bypass leads to essentially installing rooftop solar versus perhaps maybe going to grid scale renewables. So for example, in California, grid scale renewables, you can get those for way, way less than $3 a watt. In particular, many of the solar systems built in the Central Valley and in Southern California, out in the desert, they're coming in at half of the price of say, a $3 per watt system that they're putting on your roof. I mean, they just come in and they fill the entire field. So what we want is, if what we're interested in is the least cost deployment to meet the renewable energy goals, this inefficient pricing is, if you like, blocking a lot of much more cost-effective investments in grid scale renewables. Okay. So the next is adapting the regulatory process to the new competitive landscape, and here's where, at least one of my favorite quotes from John Maynard Keynes, or at least attributed to Keynes, is this one. And essentially, this is, I think, particularly in California, and I even think, here, this is a problem that the utilities and the PUCs sort of need to certainly get in front of, in the sense that, the interesting thing is there's no guarantee that you're going to get cost recovery for something that is essentially obsolete. The sort of regulatory bargain of a fair return is, as we said, it's an opportunity to earn a fair return, but not a fair return on essentially a regulated asset that is no longer necessary. It's obsolete. Now, it is true that I'd argue at least that rooftop solar does not render the transmission or distribution grid obsolete, but some judge could go be convinced by some party that says, wait, I'm using this thing far less intensively, or I rarely if ever use it, so therefore part of it's obsolete, and so you don't get cost recovery. So and the more people that are installing distributed solar, the more the politics are going to probably work in their favor, because they perhaps would want to push those costs onto someone else. So what would be the proposed solution? How might we deal with all the issues that we've just raised? Well, the first would be reform pricing to what I'll call concepts of cost causation and what I'll call ability to pay. The other is, and this is a lesson from a number of markets around the world, particularly small markets, is introduce what I'll call a cost-based short-term market for wholesale electricity to set the hourly wholesale price of electricity that goes into the reformed retail price. And then the other is, essentially enhance transmission planning process to essentially to support this sort of deployment of renewables and at the grid scale as well as distributed. And then one thing that certainly is worth considering, and I think is if you like, a no-brainer in terms of really facilitating what you want, given that I would one of the things that's definitely going to be true is you're going to get a lot more price volatility in a system where you have a lot of intermittent renewables, and you want to be able to benefit customers with the fact that they can see that it's a good time to consume, it's a bad time to consume, and they can be rewarded for that. Well, you need to measure it in order to price it, and in terms of rewarding someone for shifting, you need to have interval meters. The standard thing is just bite the bullet, make it a regulated service that the incumbent utility provides, in the same sense that, and then, at least you've now got this technology in place. These meters are not that expensive. They have a number of other benefits for outage detection, other kinds of things. It strikes me as it's a no-brainer. Okay, so what do I mean by setting retail prices based on cost causation and willingness to pay? What we do is we say, okay, we've got an hourly cost of grid-supplied electricity plus an hourly marginal cost of delivering energy to the customer. And then what we do is the remainder of the costs are going to be covered through a monthly fixed fee. And we're going to base this on some measure of willingness to pay. Now, you might go, wait a minute, willingness to pay. What's going on here? Well, every place that you see increasing block pricing, that's all they're doing. Okay? It's not that the marginal cost of supplying me an additional megawatt of energy or kilowatt hour of energy during the month is getting more expensive as I consume more. It's all about, fleecing the people that have the highest willingness to pay. I just move you up that increasing block price schedule. This, I'd argue, at least makes it more obvious, but still, that's the basic idea, is that we want to transition much more to a system that looks like a cable television bill, where I essentially say, okay, I connect to the cable, and then if I want to watch this fight, I just pay per view, or if I want to watch HBO, I pay a little bit more, but there is basically a monthly fixed cost for the option to purchase grid-supplied electricity at the hourly marginal cost of supplying me that grid-supplied electricity. The other is, I think, that going to this kind of scheme makes it much easier if someone wants to opt out, because basically you say, look, as part of the fact that we built this network for you, and there is essentially a potential your share, and what would happen is, they say the customer pays a monthly $1 per month fixed fee for this right, and in this paper, I sort of outline what I think is a really neat way to come up with how you allocate those fixed costs based on this measure of willingness to pay that's fairly straightforward, based on data that you have on the historical data on the customer's consumption. It's fairly straightforward to do. All right, so what about, and then as we said, is the cost-based short-term market is going to set this hourly marginal cost of grid-supplied electricity. And what happened, and what do I mean by this cost-based market? Well, a number of countries around the world wanted to capture the benefits of these short-term market mechanisms. And what are those benefits? Well, the benefits is that I want to pool the generation resources that I have to always produce whatever I'm producing in each hour at least cost. Okay, and oftentimes in a number of contexts, that's not done. In other words, I want to optimize the configuration of the resources that I have so that I'm serving the demand for grid-supplied electricity at least cost, at least based on my measure of cost that I have. And the nice thing about this is this creates, if you like, a short-term market against which all PPAs that are signed can clear. And I'll go through an example of what I mean. And these markets existed since 1980 in Chile, in Bolivia, Peru, a whole bunch of, think of all the Central American countries like El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica. All these places have effectively cost-based markets, and believe it or not, peak demands that are at least maybe as high or even lower than what existed in Oahu. So, and they have been definitely realizing major benefits. And what are the benefits? The benefits they've been realizing is the fact that if I'm a new entrant, I want to go invest in one of these countries, I know that when I sell my PPA to the, say, incumbent utility or to some large load, I know essentially what I'm going to be able to clear my imbalances against. And what I mean by that, I mean this, is that suppose that I come in and I say, I'm selling 100 megawatts each hour of the day for 10 years from my unit. Well, I'm not really. What I am doing is I'm committing to say, counterparty to this PPA, you have the right to purchase 100 megawatt hours each hour of the day for 10 years at the fixed price that we negotiated in this PPA. And there'll be hours when my plant doesn't produce, and there'll be hours when my plant produces more than 100 megawatt hours. During the hours when it produces less, I'm going to buy out of the short-term market to effectively meet my obligation, or think of it as my buyer is going to buy out of the short-term market at the prevailing short-term price. I'm going to make a payment to him that effectively makes the price that he purchased 100 megawatt hours at equal to the PPA price, and correspondingly, I may also be times when I want to produce more than my 100 megawatt hours because the price is so attractive to me. I will get paid a price that's essentially the short-term price from that market. And this existence of, as I say, is this option to buy in the short-term market at a cost-based market certainly reduces the risk of the supplier signing the PPA, because immediately I have a replacement for non-compliance, if you like, with the PPA, in the sense that whenever I'm unable to meet it, I just buy out of the short-term market. Whenever I want to sell more, I just sell into the short-term market. That's a source of additional revenues to me, means that we'll probably be able to get a better price for any PPA that I might sell. So one of the mistakes that I think was made in restructuring in most of the United States is we kind of focused on where the money wasn't in the design of our markets in the United States. In other words, we focused on making sure that that short-term market was absolutely the best market around. It was just, it had all the bells and whistles, it was really expensive, it had all these things. We were sort of trying to solve a problem that really didn't have a tremendous financial benefit. The Latin American countries, I'd argue, focused on the real problem and the big money. The big money is get that PPA for the lowest price possible, and the short-term market is just where I clear imbalances. And true, I may not get the best prices in the short-term market because I'm using the so-called cost of service, or a regulated marginal cost to set that price, but the short-term market is clearing so little power, that cost is just not that great. And so what could happen is that, as I said, the forward market for energy is very competitive. So this is getting back to, I think, one of the points that Michael raises. Suppose that, if Hawaii came in and said, look, we've got this short-term market, you as a solar provider, this is what, if you're unable to produce from your solar panels or what's happening here, here's where you're going to sell your excess solar, here's the price at which you're going to get to sell your excess solar, here's the price at which you got to buy at if you're not meeting what you have, and world, come bid on solar projects in Hawaii, you'd be getting prices that we're seeing. I find it hard to believe how Hawaii can't get prices that Mexico, not exactly the best place to invest and get your money out of, no offense to Mexico, or Chile, or Brazil all these places, they're seeing just incredibly low prices for PPAs for solar. Colombia as well, low prices for solar. Why? Because I think that these sorts of things, they know how they're going to meet their imbalances. They know how they're going to be able to sell their excess power. And the PUC could manage this procurement process, and you could essentially, if the decision is that more needed, can run that. So, as we said, this short-term market provides greater certainty in terms of, when I'm an entrant and I'm thinking about, they can pretty much run simulation models and figure out what their liability is likely to be, and essentially run this market. So what it does is it provides both. Think of it as what is the benefit to finish up. Is the benefit is going to be the fact that we're going to get a more efficient dispatch because we're going to take all these costs and we're going to optimize to figure out who produces in each hour of the day. And then the other thing is it's going to facilitate entry of resources into the market because they know how things are going to get dispatched. They know the prices at which they're going to be able to manage their imbalances. So how does it work? Pretty similar to how it works today, in the sense that for each of the units, you'll have a heat rate, fuel cost, variable O&M, and heat rate is just how many BTUs do I need to have to produce a megawatt hour of energy, fuel price dollars per million BTU. Typically what will happen is that this is typically indexed to some price that the regulator thinks that the utility can purchase at, and essentially you get this variable operating maintenance cost. There would be a startup cost in each hour of the day. What you do is you just run this, what already is done, to essentially find the least cost combination of all the units in the system to manage both energy and ancillary services demand. And you can actually do this subject to all operating and constraints on the grid. This will yield an hourly market clearing price through the standard way that we compute it, and it can price transmission congestions, losses, using what's called locational marginal pricing. What does that mean? I'll explain that in a second. Yeah, well, here. So we can also co-optimize the procurement of the energy with the ancillary services, and units that are owned by both guys can also sell these ancillary services. Not a problem. So we can further reduce the cost of operating the system in real time. And as I said, and if you're more interested in what LNP is in more detail than I'm going to say in the next slide, there's a paper on my website that discusses it in a bit more detail. The big challenge is going to be, what are marginal distribution costs? One of the things that we do with distribution networks now is we basically say, what's the highest possible amount of power that could ever flow over this distribution grid? Double it. And that's how much we build for the distribution grid. So we don't spend a lot of time thinking about pricing the distribution grid, but in some sense, given what we're doing with respect to distributed solar, given what we think that people may want to do, I think is much more imperative that we think about how to price the distribution grid. And simple models in terms of just finding what are marginal losses, that's fairly straightforward, but there are certainly more complex models that essentially attempt to extend locational marginal pricing of the transmission network down to the distribution grid. That's a very active area of research, and certainly I think is where things need to go as more and more places attempt to do what California and Hawaii are attempting to do. And then the other thing is that it can't be emphasized enough, which is you may think this is a heavy lift. It's not. It's like I said, this was implemented in places with weak regulatory institutions, very, very low cost. Effectively, what they did was just, most every control area is already doing what I was just describing. It's just that what they're not doing is putting in, if you like, the right costs and maybe not modeling some of the constraints. So it's just not a huge change relative to what's being done. And then the other thing is that moving to this, what you'll get is potentially you can get some pretty sort of volatile wholesale prices. Those are going to be the things, the short-term prices rather, they're going to provide the mechanism for things like storage, for load shifting, for active demand side participation, all these kind of things, because you've got this price that is changing on an hourly basis, okay? And it's providing the mechanism for essentially the economic signals as to what people should be doing. So what is LMP? At the highest level, the way to think about it is what you can do, the simple way to think about how you clear a market is you take everybody's bids, okay? So think of it as you take everybody's bids and you say, what I want to do is minimize the cost, if you like, bid price times quantity supplied, okay? Minimize the sum of those things over all bids times quantities, subject to meeting the market demand, okay? Or that's just, if you like, the math programmer's way of saying, compute the aggregate supply curve and cross demand with that. You get the same result. If you say, minimize the sum of people's bid price times bid quantity, okay, area underneath the curve, subject to meeting demand, that'll do it. What LMP does is it basically says, it does the same thing. It says minimize that cost, but now what we're going to do is we're going to say, you got to meet demand at every location in the network. So we're going to potentially get different prices at different locations, because why? Because power can't flow from A to B. And then oftentimes we then have things like ramping constraints, in that the unit can't move from 0 to maximum capacity within an hour. It's going to take time. And you can build all those kinds of constraints into this optimization problem. It just becomes, in the language of optimization, it just becomes a minimized subject to a set of linear equality and inequality constraints. Pretty straightforward problem. And what you get out is what's called the locational marginal prices, and they are just simply what is the increase in the optimized value of that objective function with respect to pulling out one more unit of demand at a given location in the transmission network. And you can also include in here not only energy, but as bid cost of energy and ancillary services, and therefore you're essentially minimizing the total cost to operating the system. And as I said, there's plenty of very simple, off-the-shelf kinds of methods to do that. And just to give an example, these are bid-based LMP markets operate throughout the United States. They also are New Zealand, even in Singapore, a probably even smaller geographic area. And so it's, as I said, fairly straightforward. Mostly, and so, as we said, the other thing about it is that regulating HECO under this kind of regime is not, as I said, not significantly different from the current regime. All you would do is still set their revenue requirement and allow recovery through the fixed charges and the price of delivered energy. So what does it cost to have this unit? How much does it operate? In other words, what was the cost of operating it? That's going to be the cost for that unit on an annual basis. True, sometimes they're selling through the system, sometimes they're not. You can then maybe have a sharing rule where, to the extent that if HECO operates more efficiently than you thought they would operate, you give their shareholders a little bit of that money. That's certainly a lot of options. So, as I said, the cost-based model, I think, has been very successful, and certainly, I think most folks in Latin America would agree with this. Been very successful at effectively really facilitating this competition. And what it's particularly good at is, if you have it and you have goals to get a lot of investment, and you say, okay, well, what is the goal here? The goal here is to get a lot of renewable investment. Having this market, I think, will certainly help to facilitate that. And as I said, there's sort of more details discussed in there. Okay, so transmission and distribution network, sort of step 3. So step 3, so we said, okay, make the recommended retail pricing change, have the cost-based market, this is going to eliminate the inefficient bypass of grid supplied electricity. That may help to solve a lot of your problems with needing to build out the distribution network a lot, because odds are most of the renewable energy will likely be coming from sort of grid scale projects rather than rooftop solar. But still, we probably want to give people the option to have rooftop solar, because yes, it is fun at the cocktail party to brag about how much your solar panels are producing and how you did a much better job of siting them on their roof than your neighbor's roof. And you know, it's sort of the new thing in California, rather than talking about your fancy car, and talk about that. But so, you know, as I said, it can be very costly though if everybody's putting them on the roofs to essentially accommodate them in the distribution network. See the example I gave from California. But as I said, we probably want to give everyone the option, because after all, this is America and we believe in choice. So, you know, and the other is that, you know, I think there are other reasons besides just simply, you know, that what's the cheapest source of renewable energy. You know, if someone wants to make the statement, I guess the other thing I'd say is, in California, it's typically the case that the solar panels tend to face the street. So, and then some people even go as far as putting a little sign in their front yard that says, "I have Solar City panels. What do you have?" So, you know, it's as I said, we want to balance these two goals. Is that we're aiming for essentially a distribution and transmission network that effectively facilitates the least cost deployment of these two products. That basically says you got to expand your planning tools and the like. You know, I think this, to me, this is another area that I think is really interesting and exciting in thinking about, you know, how you're going to do that. But I think the other thing is to think about it in a dramatically different way. What I like to think about is, in the old world, what I would call is there was engineering reliability. We sort of planned the system for what I would call engineering reliability standards, meaning that we planned it so that if you were the centralized operator, you could meet demand with a given level of reliability. In a regime where we're allowing many different players to sell through this grid, like the PPAs, the distributed generation, the utilities generation, we want to think of transmission and distribution network as really facilitating this competition. Facilitating competition to get that least cost solution. And we're thinking of planning in that manner. And you know, I'd argue that's the paradigm that we want to think about these networks as. We think people can plug in anywhere, and we want to make sure that we're offering plugs at places that are really going to lead to the least cost deployment, not increased cost deployment. Okay, so as we said, the other thing is that this doing the pricing change that we talked about has the potential to effectively increase consumer welfare. Why do we say that? Well, we're telling the consumer, you get to purchase grid supplied electricity at a very, very low price. True, you're going to pay a higher fixed charge, but it's going to make charging your electric vehicle very efficient. And essentially facilitate, because of the fact that we think that those wholesale prices can have some within-day variation and across period variation, it's going to facilitate these investments in storage and hourly meters and the like. Okay, so basic point being is that hourly price of grid supplied electricity at marginal cost of delivery, fixed cost from retail customers, we said welfare improving, cost-based short-term market is how we're going to get that hourly price of grid supplied electricity, and essentially focus the planning process on facilitating competition between both distributed and grid supplied resources, thinking about it that way. And so what else? Managing the transition to the renewable future. Well, I guess I'll put my cards on the table with Michael. I personally don't think many people are going to disconnect in the grids. Basically because if you're at all a neurotic person, and as someone who as drives around in a battery-powered car, when that thing gets down low, you're like, oh man, no, I gotta plug in. You know, so to me, it's just one less thing I want to worry about. I'm willing to essentially have the plug, to pay for the plug, to effectively have the option. True, I have my solar panel, I have my distributed battery, all of these things which California gave me tons of money to buy, which I love, since my job as an economist is to take advantage of every subsidy California provides and be a inframarginal participant in the subsidy. In other words, there is no subsidy that I got that would have changed my behavior. I still will buy what was there, but largely because I want to learn about it. But it's a great example to teach my students about the difference between someone who's marginal to inframarginal to the subsidy. So, so the point being is that we still will need HECO to build, operate, and maintain the transmission and distribution grids. They can even own and operate generation resources under cost of service revenue recovery. My feeling would be is, look, if you guys can beat the prevailing PPA price with your project, good, you can have it. But we're going to run a level playing field for the procurement, and you're just another one of those competitors. And we're going to design it in such a way that essentially everybody can compete. I.e., don't do it the way California does it. And then the other is, as we said, is this pricing of the distribution grid. This is really where I think lots of interesting research and just thought needs to go into, and I think there's lots of things that can be done here. And then, as I said, the process of regulating marginal and fixed cost generation is pretty straightforward and familiar. The big thing to think about is you don't ask the utility what their costs are. I mean, the joke I like to tell, if you tell me that, look, you'll pay my cost, and you don't tell me how to incur my cost, which University of Hawaii did not do. They were like, you must fly a coach. I would basically rent the private plane and fly out here and say, well, that's what it cost me. And it was much nicer than waiting in the security lines at the airport. So the idea here is what we want to do is think in terms of, okay, we're going to have benchmarks, like we can say, all right, what's the price of oil delivered to, say, Hawaii? That's a way to index. So what happens in a number of the cost-based markets around the world is they'll typically take like Henry Hub plus a transportation charge to, say, Chile or to Colombia, and that is the price that goes into a cost-based market, not the supplier's actual cost. And then the final is just, as we said, these sorts of methods here, is you certainly can refine the methods for determining the monthly fixed charge, setting hourly prices. The one thing that's always true in these kinds of, when you're running the short-term short-term cost-based market, is that what constraints you model very much depend on what reliability problems you face. So for example, it's not the case, and even right now, I'm sure every day, the HECO system operator is looking at and attempting to change how they dispatch the system based on the reliability problems they face. So this is just something, and in all the markets, it's a continual process of redesigning, which is good news for folks that work on the markets, that the problems keep changing. So just to finish up, as we said, is this inefficient retail pricing in Hawaii and California is leading to inefficient dispatch and higher costs of supplying all the electricity consumed. In other words, from distributed solar and from the grid. And as we said, establishing a short-term market would lead to more efficient retail pricing. It would lead to more efficient dispatch of the units that you have, increased competition for power purchase agreements, allow you to have a level playing field for those, because now there's a straightforward way to clear the imbalances that all participants, regardless of who they are. And as I said, you need a much more sophisticated transmission planning process in order to balance these goals. But the big one is, as I said, is focusing on the fact that we're trying to facilitate this competition. And as I said, more efficient retail pricing is going to support, I think, a lot of other California's green goals, such as the electrification of the vehicle fleet. And this is not hard. As I said, this has been done in countries with institutions very, very poor legal institutions. In many ways, that's why it was done at very low cost. It's not as hard as you might think it looks. And as I said, I think this is the big area and important to try to think about. And then finally, just the point that, you know, if there's any place in the world that, you know, California in some sense, we're spending a ton of money to do something that I think Hawaii could do much more cheaply. And so in some sense, to me, it makes a lot of sense to sort of be, then you can get even more tourists coming here. They're going to be coming here to effectively see how you manage the green transition. So thanks.
Thank you. We've got about 15 minutes to open it up for questions.
Oh, no wonder you were getting restless. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Any questions? This is a little bit more technical than we usually see in Hawaii, but I think we need it. So let me start up here and then I'll come back down.
Thank you for a real interesting, informative presentation. A question, so our goal is 100% renewables in terms of how do we keep, under the scheme that you were mentioning with the markets, how do we keep it affordable for those, when we have those days when we have, you know, weeks without renewable generation, and does this still address those, because those resources have, like a PPA price, how do we price them? They're going to be very expensive, I would imagine.
Yeah, but I mean, my view would be I guess the first step that I would say is the number of reliability constraints and the like that you need to manage a system as you scale up the amount of renewables explodes. I mean, would be the simplest way that I would describe it. And so if you don't sort of go to something like this, you're just gonna, you know, you're gonna be Germany and you're gonna go bankrupt. You know, it's gonna get just massively expensive for you. And so, you know, I guess I think of it as, you know, you're sort of, the general rule of thumb is until the share of renewable energy that you get from a given resource is higher than the capacity factor of that resource, you can sort of manage the intermittency kind of like negative load. So like, for example, in California, you know, 20%, we can pretty much think of that as sort of negative load. And that's kind of how they manage it. But getting above 20%, it starts to get to be, you know, really challenging because, you know, just like what you saw in this picture here, which we in California have called, where is it? Yeah, we call this guy the duck curve, right? And so, you know, you get these vicious ramps. And so, you know, that's going to create a lot of issues that you didn't have to face before. Because load, right, is pretty smooth. It's just the fact that the net load is vicious because the sun disappears. So, you know, I have a whole other presentation where I go through and I basically say price volatility is green. Because effectively everything that's going to make the green grid go is going to require storage. And storage is buy low, sell high. They're like energy traders. That's how they make money. And to the extent maybe we get them as some sort of transmission asset and energy traders, it kind of works. So I guess what I'd say is the sort of infrastructure in terms of operating the system and pricing the system that I'm saying is going to support that as well as anything. Whether we get there and you know, that people go, well, finally I'm tired of paying, you know, $1 a kilowatt hour for my electricity because it's so expensive, all the things that I need to go 100% renewables. But I think that no matter where you stop, this is going to be a thing that's going to make it cheap to get there. And you know, I personally think that it's physically possible, but it's just the expense. And you know, like California, Hawaii can probably afford it. You know, and just charge it to the tourists, make it a part of the experience. Come to our country. There's no fossil fuel burned anywhere. We're like Iceland. but it's warm.
Okay, let's get a couple more questions at a time, and then maybe you can field a few questions
sure, sorry.
at once. So go ahead.
Great.
with your question.
Mine's going to the cost-based markets. Are there like other geographies beyond Latin America where a cost-based market short-term has been implemented and failed? Or is there any like kind of heartburn of making that transition like something that kind of got overlooked?
Say again, I'm not sure what you say.
So cost-based markets, where else they've been implemented other than Latin America and have not done well? Or what has been done poorly which made them not perform well?
Hold on, they're going to get a couple more questions. So think about that.
Sure.
Let me get a couple more questions. Who else had their hand up here? Let me get Nori and Jim. Get their questions.
You mentioned that when we implement a marginal cost pricing based on retail pricing, you could compute a fixed charge based on the previous kilowatt hour consumption.
Well, it's a willingness to pay allocation
Yeah.
scheme is the basic idea.
I was just wondering if you can compute that without knowing more than exchange volume, for example. Don't you need to know something like price elasticity of demand or interval elasticity?
Yeah, think of it as the perfect, not wanting the perfect to be the enemy of the good. We can refine it, right? It's just that what I want to do is just get to the point of, think of it this way. We're gonna stick the rich people because they can pay. And so the question is, we can improve it and we can continually improve it. But the bottom line is just we wanna make sure we protect the poor and we stick the rich.
Frank, let me just get a couple questions
Sorry.
because there's a few people that I think want to ask.
Okay,
I want
sorry.
you to be able to at least answer
I'll
all
be
of them.
quiet.
It might
So-
be more efficient.
Why don't I?
So think about, here,
Yeah.
I'll get Jim's question and then we can cover all of them.
Yeah, this is kind of related to the first one. So as economists, we know bid-based market, we kind of know what that is, it's a market. And I may have missed something, but the way you were describing cost-based market, it sounded like more of a computation
So are bid-based.
than a market.
So are bid-based. The only difference between bid-based and cost-based is I put the cost in, but they both
Right.
compute. An L&P market works the same way, but it's just bids.
Okay, so I guess.
Oh, sorry.
Let's go back to the question that we had over here. I guess it'll just work faster that way. And I guess your question was, are there places where they've tried these cost-based markets, but they haven't worked out so well? Is that the essence?
No. I mean, so for example, just to give you, go even further, that's what, the first year of PJM was cost-based market. I mean, the thing about what most people don't realize is that power pools, which we basically had since almost the beginning of time, they're cost-based markets. So this is all it really is. But the only thing is, the two things that I would be pushing is to say, we want to price all relevant constraints in our cost-based market. Because why? Because as we transition to more intermittent renewables, the reliability constraints that we have to build into that problem become more and more complicated. And the math programming framework that we use for that kind of market is ideally suited, because basically you get a reliability constraint, it's just another linear constraint. You price it, it sets the price. And the other good thing about it is it moves certain prices quite a bit, and so it tells you, wow, it's a great place to put a storage device here because it solves a problem. And and that's what we need, simply because we want at least what I think is we are going to have a far more decentralized grid, and so having those price signals all throughout the grid is going to be very, very valuable to us. But the big objection to cost-based typically comes from the traders, because life is boring. There's nothing to do. All the action is there's nothing that Enron could have done in a cost-based market. It's like you just, okay, that's what the power is. Oh, I get paid relative to my forward contract. Done. But in some sense, I'd argue that's what we want people to focus on, on those sorts of things. But I also would say I'd blame autonomous to some extent, since we sort of said, well, the perfect is a bid-based market that's competitive. But hey, it's very hard to get a bid-based market that's competitive in a small market that's not used to having market mechanisms, that has a lot of problems with collusion, that has a lot of problems with sort of back dealing, so we'll just do cost-based market.
Any more questions?
I'm happy to defer to somebody else. I can talk to him later, some sort of
I think these are kind of elaborations on what the other questions were, but one was, it was a little unclear in a cost-based market where the cost profiles come from. So, I mean, you had talked about a PPA sort of goes in there.
No.
I guess the question is like, you had talked about sort of flipping the idea, so the PUC is telling
This.
the utility what they'll pay. Right, so
No.
who sets those
PUC
and how?
says, PUC, you tell me this, and I go and verify it with your engineers, and if they lie, I put them in jail, right? And I also know, I mean, these are pretty standardized kinds of turbines and things like that, that's not hard. This, I can get as, you know, if it's oil, I can say Brent plus whatever, or whatever you want diesel to be, I can use an index. This, I can get from EIA, and we can argue about it as to whether it's higher in Hawaii or not. It's done, and then we can argue, okay, how much does it cost to start your unit? Again, that's pretty straightforward. You know, I may get it a little wrong. And then, you know, we have a process that we adjust those, all the units file those, and then that's what we use to dispatch the system every day, to set prices, to do everything we need.
So the utility is, the PUC is regulating then on a much more granular level where it's like, let's discuss the costs of individual plants rather than
No, I mean, you
the
can
overall
set up,
revenue
it's pretty
requirement.
simple, you just set up rules. So you report to me your heat rate. They're already doing all this anyway, but you report your heat rate, and moreover, I'm not even gonna listen to you when you tell me what your fuel cost is, because I'm gonna say, I think you could buy it for this, and if you can do better, you keep the money. And similarly here. And so in many ways, it's much simpler. Now with PPAs, the nice thing is that then yes, for PPAs, you can run an auction for the PPA, and then they know that they clear against the price that's going to be set from this, and you can then let HECO, you can let anybody else you want participate in supplying a PPA. And and if they can think they can do it cheaper than the new entrant, you can give them the contract. But both are competing to supply this PPA, knowing that this is how their unit's going to get dispatched if they build it.
Okay. And then the other was on allocating fixed costs among customers. There's, at least initially, it's potentially quite regressive because you're saying everyone's going to get a $150 base charge or something. And 4 cents a kilowatt hour, which is much.
You always stick it to the rich people.
So I guess that's my question: is how do you allocate this more to rich people? Because right now it's a per household, regardless of the size of household.
Well, that's clearly wrong. But I mean, there's a variety of ways you can do it. I mean, I have a way that I outline in my paper. But to take an example, like for example, Columbia, a market that I've done a lot of work on, what they do is literally they have different charges for different neighborhoods. So they go in and they say, oh, lots of rich people live here. Oh, fixed charge high. And they go, oh, lots of poor people live here. Fixed charge is low. And so, they just have what they call various stratos. Now you could break it up even more, but the basic idea is it's the rule of taxation, right? Pluck the goose with the least amount of hissing. And it's the rich people. They're probably okay with it. But the big thing is we have to. Well, they're not okay with it. But I'm sorry, that's the way life works. But the nice thing, but to get back to your point about how would we deal with poor people, the nice thing is you could literally say you could just give people's discounts on the fixed charge, and then you just got to get it from the people up at the top on their fixed charge. But we want everybody to pay that marginal price, right? Because we don't want anybody to do the wrong thing in terms of bypass.
Yeah, go ahead. Let's do one more. If there's one more question, and I'll get Mark Duda, and then we'll end it.
Thanks very much for all of that. I'm not an economist, so I may ask a question here that's slightly heretical. And I'll start by saying I'm a little bit skeptical of the inefficient bypass idea. for the same reason you mentioned, that people might have a lot of reasons to choose to install distributed solar. And we have a lot of reasons society that we might want to allow people to install rooftop solar.
I couldn't agree more with you. But I just don't want to make it so obvious that even somebody like me, who really just wants to solve the problem, rather than, display virtue on my roof, and I was forced to display virtue on my roof because of California's policies. I just want to make sure that those people also get what they want. That in other words, if what I want is, I want the cheapest way to green energy, that's what I want. Now, if they want to put solar panels on their roof and pay more than me, and literally pay more than me without imposing costs on other people, then I'm okay with that.
I think that idea of the cheapest cost of green energy is where I start to struggle, because we don't do a good job of valuing all those other reasons, all those other things.
Yeah, but that's like, until you put a price on carbon, then come talk to us. Because then it's just your personal view versus my personal view. I mean, that's the problem, is that yes, I agree with you that we're not valuing all those attributes, but there's lots of attributes of every product you buy that the market doesn't value. That's why you buy them. But if there are externalities that are unpriced, there's lots of externalities we don't price, and but then let's price that externality, then we can have a talk.
Okay, but so here's where we end up. Because we haven't priced those externalities, your proposal, I fear, actually slows cuts back on one of the sort of great attributes of rooftop solar, which is the ability to very quickly add renewables in a time of climate crisis. And so if people now are faced with, rather than check the box and I get solar and I know the rate, versus I get solar and I have to guess what the marginal cost is going to be in the future, do we end up now picking we're living with our external, in a system that doesn't have externalized costs, as opposed to something that we societally decide is a good idea. We want lots of rooftop solar. So here's the question.
I don't know that society said that.
Well,
I think
we've
society wants
it.
to solve the climate problem. I don't know that society wants rooftop solar.
So,
I mean, I've never seen a survey that says, yes, we want lots of rooftop solar. I think people say we want to solve the climate problem.
here's the question. In these markets that use the short-term cost, pricing, is there any empirical evidence about what that does to people's incentive to do distributed energy?
Well, there's very little distributed energy where it's not subsidized. I mean, that's just a fact. But the thing is that is what I think will certainly happen if you do the other way, is grid supplied renewables are competing like crazy in Latin America against every kind of resource you can imagine. The only place they're not competing very well is in the United States. Why? Because we have shale gas. And that's why they still require help there. But in Latin America, renewables are going crazy because they got to buy natural gas as LNG in most of these places. They are not really interested in coal for the obvious reason. Coal is quite expensive for them since a lot of the coal is not produced domestically. So they're renewables, like in Mexico, renewables are winning PPAs at like $25, $35 a megawatt. I mean, you saw my number on on rooftop solar. I mean, come on, if it's $25 a megawatt hour to $30 a megawatt hour for grid scale renewables, that's going to annihilate rooftop, and you're going to get solar deployed much faster. I mean, it's going to be very hard for the thermal resources to compete against that. But I agree with you completely that we want to provide people with the option to do that. And I think that's right, but you got to balance the two. I mean, if what you want to ultimately do is achieve the goal, people got a finite amount of money, and so it's just, if you look globally in terms of what's happening in renewables, grid scale is just going like gangbusters. Now, a lot of that is due to the fact that the Chinese are willing to sink infinite amounts of money to give away solar panels to the rest of the world. Maybe that'll stop, but the good news is the Indians want to get into that. So they want to also spend lots of money to produce solar panels for cheap that go to everywhere in the world. So good news for us.
Let me get one more question, even though we're a little bit late. Sorry, I already told Mark that I'd get him. I think it's actually $20 a megawatt hour in Mexico they got.
Well, I mean, a lot of these things are vapor projects, so that's why I mean, a lot of these projects, it's just the developer takes the big and walks away and nothing gets built, so.
My sense of the PUC proceeding that we have here to look at performance-based regulation is actually to incentivize the utility to operate more efficiently. So that actually doesn't deal with the 4 cents, it's the 18 cents of the 23 cents. And so whether we recover it through $150 a month fixed fee or 18 cents a kilowatt hour, it seems like this scheme doesn't really address that issue, which, you know, I would say not coincidentally is because this is the place where there are rate-basable expenditures in a world where the utility faces competition from distributed solar.
Yeah, I would say, I'll give you a couple of my slides, look over the first few first, because the whole point is that you set the firm's price, they have an incentive to minimize cost. So what you have to do is figure out what the price is that you want to set. I mean, the regulatory process provides strong incentives for the firm to produce efficiently if you can commit to that price for a sustained period of time. So, I mean, the issue is maybe they set it too high, but then we get into the problem that I also talked about is they go, hey, you're stealing my assets. I'm going to file a lawsuit against you, and I'll probably win because I'll, you know, hire way more consultants than the PUC has to essentially convince the judge that that's what you're doing.
And so the fixed fee is $150 now, and then it ramps down over time.
Well, no, I mean that's I mean, think of it as what we're talking about is revenues to the firm, independent of what I charge you. I can give a certain amount of revenues to the firm, right?
Right.
So the idea is that what we're about is it doesn't matter what I charge you, because there's also what's called balancing accounts. So I can essentially collect whatever I collect from you, and I can say, that's staying in a balancing account, you don't get that, and then I can cut the rate in a future period because the balancing account's positive. So, you know, it's all about how much revenue I'm going to get into the utility, and you know, you can choose however you want to do that. But the big point is you want to make sure that the revenue you give to utility is independent of its actions that it takes, so that you keep him or her, or whatever utility is, wanting to minimize costs. Right? So, you know, what I'm talking about in terms of retail pricing is about making people make the efficient decision between grid scale versus distributed. But that's separate from the issue of what am I going to give to the utility?
Right, and I think my point is that, I think that second question is the point of this docket that's ongoing to try to get the utility to lower its costs for whatever unit of service.
Yeah, and I would argue cost of service does as well as anything. That's just a fundamental difficult problem, is that just says more due diligence on cost of service. Is that, I mean, one of the big, you have to effectively, you know, regulation, I mean, regulation is all about me being able to convince the jury that I'm right and you're wrong. And that typically comes from deference. So what it really is a case of getting the courts to give deference to a utility, and that is a challenging thing. Because, you know, who are you going to believe? The guy that actually runs the power plant, or the guy that sits in the PUC's office and pretends to run the power plant? That's hard. But the bottom line is, you know, it just, you know, you're having to determine what the firm's prudently incurred costs are and credibly enforce that. Fundamentally, what you got to do, and that's hard.
Okay, thank you. Frankie gave us a lot to think about. I know I'm going to be thinking about this a lot over the next coming weeks. And a lot of us are going to be meeting with Frank at various times next week. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate your attention, and thank you, Frank, for coming. This was great.